And thank you to Shantideva for your kind invitation and for hosting this class. I'm really looking forward to spending the next 3 weeks with you and thinking through the complexity of being emotional creatures for whom emotional experience comes with immense possibility and challenge. For those of you who know me, you're aware that it's a topic that I love to explore, in part because it's been my experience that for many people who were not born in Buddhist countries or raised in Buddhist families, it's often an emotional experience that becomes the engine for curiosity about the Buddhist path and Buddhist teachings. And that is surely the case with psychotherapy. It's the rare person who goes into therapy without some emotional experience that has been tough to work out on one's own. And so tonight and over the next few weeks, we'll think together about particular feelings and how to understand them, how to formulate them, how to work with them, both from a Buddhist psychological and a Western psychotherapeutic perspective. And so tonight I'm going to start with anxiety and anger, which for many of us are challenging, affective, emotional experiences, but also really layered with lots of meaning. Collective meaning, personal meaning, familial, etc. And so I'm going to share some slides with you, and then I'll be sure to protect time for your questions, for some conversation, and then we'll close out with a short guided practice. Okay. So let's see. Wiley, am I a co-host yet so that I can share the slides? I am. Okay, great. Terrific. Okay. All right. How's that looking? Can everybody see that? Great. Okay, so we're going to start with anxiety. Then we'll shift into anger. And one of the reasons why I grouped anger and anxiety together is because often they are linked, right? Often anger can stir anxiety, and the suffering that we experience with anxiety can stir some agitation and anger, but we'll think through together the other ways in which these experiences are linked. So just to start us off, I'm aware that for many of us, it's not always that easy to discern whether we're anxious or we're afraid. And I know sometimes I really have to check in with myself to try to assess, is it fear or is it anxiety primarily that I'm experiencing? And part of the reason why it's hard to figure out is because there is overlap. Both fear and anxiety are protective, right? And this is helpful to know because nobody enjoys being anxious or afraid, but it is the body and the mind's way of trying to get ready for something that feels threatening or dangerous. And so in this way, we can start to generate a little bit of appreciation, even for our anxiety, right? Because it's trying to help us out. And both fear and anxiety are really trying to prepare the body and the mind to withstand challenges and to survive, right? This is our survival instinct getting activated, kicking into gear. So another reason why it's not always easy to discern what's anxiety and what's fear is because the body has a similar response, right? The body is sensing danger, right? And people in the polyvagal world and the nervous system world, the neuroscience world, they know that before the mind has a response to what's going on, the body responds. And this is in the polyvagal world referred to as neuroception, right? The nervous system is sensing something is going on that doesn't feel safe. After the body has that response, the mind is on board to start to narrate what it is that's generating that lack of safety. So just to give you a little bit of a visual for how somatic fear and anxiety are, here we have a nice and simple representation of the autonomic nervous system, right? Which is basically the body's surveillance system. And it's equipped with the capacity to feel connected and safe and well, but it's equally equipped with whatever it is the body senses is needed in order to cope and survive. And so when we're feeling afraid or anxious, there's been some sympathetic nervous reaction, activation. And here you see the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. It runs along the spinal cord. And it's basically going to mobilize us to survive, right? We start to feel the release of adrenaline and cortisol. We start to feel our heart rate increase and the muscles tense and the rhythms of the breath change. And while none of that is comfortable, it's still the body trying to get ready, right? To ward off whatever it is that's interrupting feelings of relative safety. And I won't say too much about the ventral vagal and the dorsal vagal aspects of the nervous system, but it's helpful to remember we do have this fight or flight mobilization response, even to psychological material. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. Okay, so that's the basic groundwork around the similarities between fear and anxiety. But there are some significant differences, and they're helpful to think about when we're trying to assess what's going on, when we're noticing the physical experience of dis-ease, discomfort, right? I mean, one of the reasons why anxiety is so tough to withstand is because it feels so dreadful, right? It is so physiologically uncomfortable, as is fear. But I want to just offer you one way to understand the differences. And we need a fear response, right? I mean, we've just been through, for those of you who live in the New York City area, we've just been through an extreme weather event. And so the fear you may have felt, for instance, if you lived in a basement level apartment or a part of the city that was prone to flooding, right, was a fear response. And that would be an appropriate, logical reaction to a tough situation that you were aware you would have to face, right? If we have no fear response when we're dealing with external triggers, then that can actually endanger us, right? So the fear is just helping us get ready. Anxiety, in contrast, still has that strong signal from the autonomic nervous system that danger is lurking, right? Something is going on that does not feel safe. But unlike the fear response, what it is that's dangerous, right, is unknown. We sense it, right, but we can't quite put our finger on it. There's a sense of threat, but it's usually laden with a lot of personal, subjective meaning, right? So in this way, there's a little bit of a discrepancy with anxiety between the external threat or the supposed external threat and the inner response. And this can be a little bit embarrassing. So for instance, if someone has social anxiety and they've been invited to meet some friends for a coffee or drink or a stroll in the park, but they're aware of feeling anxiety, it can be a little embarrassing because they're conscious of the fact that nothing is likely to happen that's terribly problematic. And yet, there's gripping in the solar plexus, right? The heart rate is a little bit accelerated. There's discomfort in the body. But what's actually been stirred is not yet fully formulated or clear. So how do we discern the difference? It's not always clear, and that's okay too, right? But one way we can consider, as we're also thinking about what's external and what's internal, is how strong the response is, how long lasting is the response, and is what we're experiencing thwarting our ability to be in life? Is it hurting us, or is it hurting others? So to just use again the storm as an example, if you were aware that you needed to tie up your rugs, you needed to make sure that your pets were safe in your apartment, you probably felt some agitation as you were getting ready to take care of business and keep yourself and your loved ones safe. But then after doing so, the fear settles. You might have other feelings, right? Because not easy to go through, but the fear, diminishes. If it doesn't, right, that might be a little bit of an indicator of some lurking anxiety. So let's have a look at some of the internal psychological causes of anxiety. And I find these insights helpful. They come from a number of psychoanalytic theorists, including Karen Horney, who wrote beautifully about the nature of anxiety, bringing in both a psychodynamic, right, or intrapsychic, psychological perspective, and a collective or cultural perspective. And I think both views are very helpful when we're trying to understand our experience of anxiety. And Karen, like many other psychoanalysts and more recently psychotherapists, would suggest that often the origins of our anxiety are unconscious. Right? We sense that something's going on, but we can't quite lift it to awareness. What we're conscious of is we have a story about it, right? So to use the social anxiety as an example, I'm aware that I've been invited to this party, but I'm an introvert and parties freak me out and I never know what to say and it's awkward and then I want to leave. End of story. And sometimes it feels like enough to just stay with that story, but there are invariably deeper layers that are generating those experiences. Horney and others would say that in addition to this unconscious experience, there are usually unconscious conflicts, conflicting beliefs, conflicting desires, right? This is true of many people in the helping professions. There might be a conscious belief that they really want to devote themselves and their lives to caring for others and to compassion and to really being attentive to suffering. But unconsciously, there's a part that says, enough, I've had it. Where's the person taking care of me? I'm tired of everybody's needs, right? Getting overwhelmed. And sometimes if those feelings or those beliefs get too split or polarized, what we're conscious of is stress, anxiety, right? Some agitation. This is also true with conflicting beliefs that are culturally mediated. And so some of you might have been raised with the belief that it's a good idea to care for others, right? To be neighborly, to be your brother's keeper. But equally, you may have been raised with the belief that you have to look after yourself, right? If you're going to get the good stuff in life, you have to prioritize yourself. It's a dog eat dog world. Tension, stress, anxiety. Or I would say this is especially true in any culture that's highly individualistic, because we all end up internalizing beliefs about prioritizing one's own well-being that may very well be at odds with other beliefs about the fact that we're in an interdependent system, that we all suffer, that we all need care, etc. Some analysts would suggest that often with anxiety, there's fear of catastrophe, right? There's fear of disaster. And the mind can get a little bit fixated on the external representation of catastrophe, right? We'll feel anxious about whether or not to take a trip or pursue a job opportunity or to see a friend. And consciously, we're thinking about what could happen externally, right? I take this job and then it's a mess and I really lose my way professionally. But it might also be representing an inner experience of disaster that's been harder to access, right? Sometimes before we're verbal, sometimes before we have a mind that we can use in a reflective way. And interestingly, this is also true around growth, right? Which is why sometimes exciting opportunities, they start out feeling exciting, but they quickly become sources of stress and anxiety. What could change? Right? What could emerge internally that shifts our sense of who we are or shifts our primary relationships? So given how challenging anxiety is just to feel, right? And given how arduous it is to actually find our way into the deeper causes of anxiety, it makes sense that most people are going to develop lots of defenses against the anxiety itself. Right? And it becomes a little bit of a problematic loop. I want to suggest to some extent we're all affected by it. A common way to defend against anxiety is to rationalize it, right? To basically use our discursive mind. Right? If, again, let's just stay with the social anxiety. Okay, parties are not that interesting. There's a lot of work I could be doing. I could be doing my taxes. I could be helping my niece, right? The mind just steps in to try to come up with a narrative, a storyline for why we're feeling the stress. Interestingly, we can also completely block it out. This is why some people are extremely anxious, but they don't know it. Other people know it and feel it and pick it up, right? But it really gets pushed into the unconscious, or it even gets pushed into their sense of other people. More commonly, we'll find some way to just feel better fast. And we all know the different ways we can do that. We can do it through food, we can do it through drugs, we can do it through alcohol, through sex, anything that offers us an immediate relief from the agitation that we're feeling. So some people will risk doing the things that stir anxiety, but will then try to self-soothe, right? Other people will simply stay away from anything they have learned is going to activate the anxiety. And this is where life can get a little narrow, right? And it's poignant because, again, I think this is very common to sense that there are certain experiences that are very stirring, that just activate our nervous system. They threaten us with certain feelings that we may have unconsciously decided are too threatening to feel consciously. So we simply avoid the trigger, right? So in a therapeutic process, if someone was wanting to do some work with their anxiety, we would slowly, patiently start to map out somebody's history, and especially the parts of someone's history that have remained a little murky, right? That again are sensed but not fully held in the mind, fully formulated. And we would do that not to get too fixated on the past because we're living now, right? But to try to understand the original causes of anxiety. And I have a mentor who said that the reason why in psychotherapy we think about our childhood, we think about the past, is really so that we can generate compassion for what we're going through now. Because if we're not clear enough about the causes of our anxiety now, we're probably going to suffer. So if we can develop some compassion for our suffering, right, both the manifest suffering of the anxiety itself and the original causes of anxiety, interestingly, what was a trigger can start to diminish, right? There's like a well of curiosity that comes in to offer sustenance. And as that process is happening, we might begin to tap into a little more flexibility as we're working with the triggers for our anxiety. Okay, so what does Buddhist psychology have to say about anxiety? And there are a number of different sources. Generally speaking, especially if you're working with the Abhidharma, which is the primary canon of Buddhist psychology, really what's suggested is that anxiety it's a manifestation of suffering, right? It's a form of dukkha in distinction from the pain that's unavoidable, right? By nature of having bodies that are prone to illness, we know we experience pain. By nature of loving and experiencing loss, there's going to be pain. But the Buddha wanted to suggest that our suffering is actually something we have agency to work with and reduce. And that anxiety really comes from a basic but very pervasive misperception of how embedded we are, right? And this incredibly wild, expansive mosaic of causes and conditions. Right? The Buddha said everything about us is relational. Our minds, right? Our bodies, our thinking. It's all a result of how we've been influenced, right? How we're working with our reality. But what can easily happen is instead of feeling that embeddedness, that relationality, we feel the sense of separateness, right? The sense of not really being part of the same system. And that separateness, which is caused by a lot of egocentric concern, right? This fear of what will happen if we don't keep our attention fixated on self, and then all of the notions of who we are, right? And the paranoia about who other people are and what we have to do to stay safe, that's the engine that drives anxiety. There's a lot more to say about that, but just to give you a general taste for the Buddhist insight into anxiety, it really comes from this sense of fundamental separateness. So interestingly, people like Jack Engler, who died not long ago, but really was a beloved Buddhist teacher and clinician, he asked a really fascinating question, which I've always appreciated. If self-grasping, right, if getting lost inside ourselves, fixated on ourselves, whether it's our history or it's our current circumstances, if it causes so much suffering, it's certainly for self and for others, why do we keep doing it? Right? What's the point? Interestingly, that question is not asked in the Abhidharma. What is addressed is the fallout of that self-grasping. And so Jack wanted to suggest the reason why we default to this feeling of self-grasping and separateness is that it's actually protecting against a root cause. Right? And the root cause of our anxiety from a Buddhist perspective is the truth of our fluidity, the truth of how dynamic, how impermanent we are, and that it scares us, right? We like to feel more solid. We like to feel like, you know, we're not standing on a too porous surface, right? We want to feel reliably held. And so Jack wanted to suggest, and I find this to be a really compelling insight, that one thing we do unconsciously is we swap out the truth of that fluidity, more classically referred to as emptiness, right? Empty of any solid, permanent characteristics. We swap it out for solidity, right? We seem to need the immediate self-soothing of that sense of permanence. But the problem is anxiety quickly follows, right? There's conflict there between the truth and the protection against the truth. So it's a totally understandable defense, right? But it causes a lot of other forms of suffering, a lot of paranoia, resentment, if it seems like other people have what we want, loneliness, and tremendous amounts of anxiety. Yeah. Okay. So what do we do? Since this is not easy to deal with and very complex, the Dharma wants to offer methods and insights that help us start to shift the focus, right, from the suffering itself, from the anxiety itself, to the causes. And for those of you who have been practicing for some time, you know, even very simple mindfulness practice can be a very effective way of tapping into that non-judgmental curiosity through which we can see more, right? We can start to feel more and see more, and especially to start to feel into some of the interlocking causes and challenges. And the interlocking causes and challenges that contribute to being by our nature an anxious person. I hear this a lot as a clinician. People decide because of their experience, it means they are by their nature anxious. It's temperamental or any other feeling. So we start to notice those narratives, and then we can potentially observe them and let them soften. And as we're doing so, frequently people will experience much more compassion and much more insight into experiences that seemed fixed in nature. but are actually dynamic. This is the beauty of the wisdom teachings. If we think we're saddled with anxiety forever, the mind actually has the capacity to notice that is not so. It shifts, it's dynamic, in dependence upon what's happening internally and externally. When you add in a psychotherapeutic process, you'd also just start to notice if we're overly identified with our anxiety. And this can happen very easily since it's such a gripping experience. And just to see what it's like to zoom out a little bit, to observe more, right? Notice what stirs the anxiety, and maybe even start to appreciate some of the courage involved in that disidentification. Right? Because when we're stepping back from what we're usually consumed by, we start to see a bigger picture. Okay, there's more to say there, but I would love to shift gears here now into anger in the spirit of time. And you'll see again some of the parallels between anger and anxiety. One primary parallel is that both experiences result from our relational nature and history. Right? The Buddha believed, as did Freud and all of the psychotherapists who were building the analytic tradition with him, that every aspect of who we are develops in the context of relationship. And that we actually discover who we are through how we're mirrored and found by another. This is particularly true early in life. It remains true throughout life. So this is the good news, right? If we didn't have an accurate mirror, we can always find people to play that role. But this is extremely influential when it comes to our relationship to feeling. Because for the first couple of years, we are picking up cues from our mother, our father, our grandmother, whomever our point person was, about what feelings are and what to do with them. And for the first many years of life, we actively need a lot of help with co-regulation. Right? None of us can easily manage our feelings on our own. We don't yet have the capacity to name a feeling, right? We're pre-verbal for the first couple of years of life. Therefore, we don't know how to understand them. We can't really lift them to awareness because we're fully experiential. So we actively need someone else to step in and help us work with these feelings that can overtake us. Okay. So we've learned a lot in this field, especially through the parent-infant research, that we do have a lifelong need for others to attune to our experience in order to regulate our feelings. And it's for this reason that I love this image here. You see this little boy and the man who's probably his dad, and they have almost exactly the same expression. Right? Attuned caregivers will really join very actively with the child, basically to convey, I am here with you in your experience. Whether it's a joyful experience or a painful experience, the child is no longer alone in it. And then the child can basically use the parent's nervous system to help them feel it and recover, because even excitement is a lot to manage when we're young. So briefly, just circling back to the somatic nature of anxiety, or anger rather, like anxiety, it's a body-based feeling, right? Like anxiety, it's fueled by the sympathetic branch of our nervous system. And similar to fear and anxiety, it's an effort at survival, trying to ward off something that feels dangerous either physically or psychologically. I like this image because sometimes when we're really furious, it can feel like we're on fire, right? That we're getting blown away by something that's very tough to manage. And if we're experiencing that early in life, we will need someone else to help us come back into a sense of relative safety, right? To be attuned with oneself and with other. Okay, so now what I'd love to do, and Wiley, thank you so much for your help with this. I'm going to show you a very brief video. Some of you have probably seen this before. It's a very famous video by Edtronic, who's a beloved developmental psychologist. And we're going to see a mother and her baby interact. And we're going to see the baby have a pretty powerful emotional reaction. And then we'll talk it through the lens of anger. Okay, so thank you, Wiley.
And I think you're going to have to stop sharing your screen.
Okay,
so
great. I'll
can...
do that. Fantastic.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Okay, thank you so much, Wiley. Okay, so all right. So I'm aware that for some of you who might be seeing that video for the first time, it's very impactful, right? Something pretty benign happened to this baby, right? The mother just got flat emotionally. There was no violence. She didn't leave the room, but she disappeared emotionally. And that alone stirred a very powerful emotional response, right? The baby is upset, but also angry, right? When the baby is screeching, she's saying, "What's happening? Where are you?" Right? Why am I feeling so alone? Now, this baby was fortunate because there's clearly a bond there and an attachment system that's developing where the baby was already expecting some repair work, right? The mother was available to offer tenderness and affection and sympathy. But if a child doesn't have that attunement, then they're going to have to figure out what to do with the anger, right? Where to put it. And usually such a child will develop different mechanisms that involve some repression. And over time, what can happen is a growing child might sense anger, feel it, but they're not able to stay with it, to feel it directly or express it directly, because some avoidance really was the best way of coping. Yeah. So as we all know, our protective defenses that form early in life are really helpful. It's a good thing we develop them because we wouldn't cope without them. But over time, they tend to generate a lot of suffering. And this is really true with repressed anger, right? Because again, like anxiety and fear or any emotional experience, there's meaning there that needs to be accessed. So it's helpful to just consider if anger has been challenging for you or for anyone that you are trying to care for or mentor, that often our experience of anger and the original struggles with anger happen entirely outside of consciousness, right? They might begin very early in life. And so the healing process in psychotherapy is to begin slowly for many people to start to make some room for the anger, but without inflaming it, right? To allow for it and to contain it. This is what an attuned caregiver will do, right? That mother did not become punitive in response to the baby's distress and anger. She was there, but she was also very containing, physically and emotionally. Right? And then slowly, when someone starts to build some trust that they can feel anger without it leading to something destructive, to start to find our way back to the original relational triggers. And almost invariably, there are very tender, very poignant feelings that the anger is protecting, right? Some deep sense of vulnerability, some almost primordial longing for care, feelings of despair, alienation, etc. And it's for this reason that I'm aware, I mean, in the Sutrayana tradition, anger gets pretty problematized. I'm a student of Shantideva and find his work to be extraordinarily helpful. And even in Shantideva's work, the great beloved 8th century Buddhist scholar, you will find that what is suggested is we basically need to snuff out our anger, that nothing but suffering can come from it. But it has been my experience, both as a student of the Dharma and as a clinician, that if we can allow for anger when it's arising, we can directly access it, then we're not going to obstruct a needed and healing exploratory process. Yeah. So what are some of the symptoms of repressed anger, since it's the rare person who doesn't have some effort to repress anger? One more overt symptom is self-harm in its many forms, right? And this could come through restricting food or being coercive with the body. It could come from actively trying to harm the body. It could come from taking risks that are actually very dangerous. And our compulsivity is also usually a little bit of a red flag from the psyche, right? That there's a struggle with heat, there's a struggle with aggression and with anger, and that we might be trying to manage it or sublimate it through work, right? Through speech, even through caregiving, right? We're going to swap out the truth of anger for kindness and compassion, etc. Addiction is usually laden with some struggles with anger, right? Because if anger is threatening to come up and it feels dangerous, right? We don't trust that we can feel it in a way that has integrity or a way that we can contain, then often we're going to try to find something to self-soothe, right? We'll also probably be struggling with repression if we're typically flooded by anger, right? If something happens, someone says something to us that's disrespectful, someone we need, who we thought we could count on, is not there for us, and then suddenly we're flooded, right? We're a volcano and the lava is just spilling out. It might seem like, hey, there's no problem because we know we're furious, but actually something has interfered with the ability to consciously feel what has caused the anger, right? And to withstand that aggression that's arising without it overtaking us. Yeah. So in psychotherapy, part of what we would do is try to make a space that is completely free from any moralizing, from judgment, right? To bring in a lot of curiosity. And this can take some time because people are often concerned that if they feel anger in a session, especially if they feel it toward the therapist, that it's going to be destructive, that it'll lead to rupture of some kind. So this is often a slow process of helping somebody start to notice the triggers, right? Their conscious relationship to anger, but also, just as we talked about with anxiety, to start to notice some of the unconscious beliefs that get activated, especially around absence of safety. And to help people understand that anger has a protective function. The question is, can we use it to notice what we're trying to protect ourselves from, rather than just getting locked in the anger? Yeah. Okay. I'll say more about transference in a minute or two. So sometimes a therapist will be on the receiving end of a patient's anger or fury or disappointment. And folks like Winnicott, who is a beloved British psychiatrist and analyst, said that optimally a loving, caring professional therapist, like an optimal, loving caregiver, is going to find a way to survive the attack without retaliating, right? To stay centered, maybe to feel, to feel the overwhelm of being on the receiving end of it. But basically to convey to someone, your anger is not too much for me to become aware of and to feel, right? And then to do the healing work of repair, right? Because when we're furious with someone, it feels like a rupture. It feels like we're no longer on the same page. And so ideally, if anger comes up in therapy toward a clinician, that's a relationship that can withstand and work with the anger so that both people can find their way back into connection. And this happens when we start to reflect, right? When we start to just hold in our own mind the experience of the anger and the cause. But in order to do that, we really have to trust that it is not too shameful to consider or think about. Right? Many people are ashamed of their anger, especially if they self-identify as a decent person, a kind person, a spiritual person, a person of religion, a person of faith. It can be very humiliating to feel really gripped by anger or hatred. So part of what we would try to do in therapy is for the therapist to hold it and chew on it, and then offer it back in a way that seems a little less destructive. Right? Offer it back with some insight. And usually this has something to do with starting to understand the origins, right? The developmental underpinnings or beliefs that are folded into anger. So for instance, some people start to believe, often early in life, that if they have any chance of being heard, any chance of being understood, they are going to literally have to shake other people into that insight and recognition. Right? They're going to have to use their fury to get people to notice what they're feeling. Unfortunately, it doesn't usually work that well because the fury freaks people out, shuts them down, and ends up actually causing, right, the distress that someone is trying to protect themselves from. Right? Some people believe that in order to get love, in order to be respected, they have to be very gentle and sweet at all times, not angry. Right? Some people believe they will definitely be abandoned if they express anger. Having grown up in the Dharma, I'm aware that lots of my spiritual friends believe that if we're really practicing, if we're really committed to our Dharma practice, then we won't suffer much anger. I think anger is just an arising like every other feeling. The question is, how are we in relationship with it? What are we doing with it? Winnicott went out on a limb and said, just consciously knowing that we can feel hatred, it makes us much more responsible. It makes us more ethical because we're not going to just repress it or get flooded by it. We're gonna actively work with it. So I think just lastly, this might be the last slide, or there might be one more. I've often encouraged clinicians who are influenced by Buddhist psychology to consider the possibility that anger, like all arisings in the mind, are empty too. And anger is not more inherently problematic than joy or love, even though joy and love feel much better than anger. These are powerful arisings, right? And like all feelings, they are laden with tremendous amount of memory, association, history, longing, right? That we can explore and we can work with. Right? So anger is empty too. Okay. So on that note, and I wonder, Wiley, is it possible to, let's see here. Okay, great. Now I can see you all. I wasn't sure if I needed to be unpinned. I would love to pause and see what this is stirring for you. See if you have any questions. If you do, you can just raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask the question, or if you prefer to write it into the chat, I will keep an eye out for the chat. Sarah, hi.
Hi. So
Hi.
I just want to pick up on the very last thing you said. I have lots of other thoughts about it, but seeing that anger is not more inherently problematic than joy, it's just another arising. And I guess I would like to know, in terms of the consequences of anger for people, for their relationships, it seems way more problematic than joy. Like joy isn't causing, I mean, not in any obvious way. I mean, I can see it's the flip side of, like, you know, aversion, but in terms of, you know, where the rubber meets the road, anger alienates people, it destroys relationships. And I think of like the Dalai Lama and his joy. I feel like that's a much better expression of a dynamic process that's the outcome of all kinds of causes and conditions than anger. It's serving the world, it's serving him. So anyway, so that's just, you caught my attention with that last comment.
Yeah.
So help me out.
Were you about to say something else, Sarah?
No, just wondering what you would say about that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question and reflection because it makes sense. I mean, right, we associate all sorts of lovely things with joy and love, right? And affection, compassion, etc. It's just that, and of course the Buddha talked about this quite a bit. What can start out as something very joyful, right? Meeting someone with whom we feel beautifully connected and attuned, right? Creating something that is filling us with a sense of aliveness and purpose can pretty easily slip into the fear of loss, which can then slip into anger and frustration and clinging, right? Terror. And of course, you're right. We want to do everything we can to unburden ourselves so that we're not constantly saddled with anger. If we are, there probably is something that we're struggling to work through. I just want to suggest that all feelings require room in the mind and the heart to simply be fully felt. And that if we can do that, for instance, with anger, then we might actually have a better chance of truth telling in a way that reduces suffering. If we know how to skillfully work with our anger, we might be able to address injustice in a way that actually helps people suffer less and feel better. We might also be able to protect ourselves from something really destructive, right? And many people who are repetitively caught in destructive scenarios don't know how to do that. And this is why I want to advocate not for feeling more anger than we feel joy and love, but for not problematizing it so much. Yeah.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up? So it sounds
Sure.
like that approach to anger I'm not a therapist, but it sounds like that's sort of a Buddhist expedient means, like, how are we going to help this person solve what it sounds like you're acknowledging is actually a really destructive problem, because it's creating all this suffering for them, right? If you're stuck in joy, I don't think you have a lot of problems. If you're stuck in anger, you're miserable. So it sounds more like a very practical, how do we help this person, rather than, oh, anger is just like joy.
Sure. Although I would say if we're stuck in any affective experience, it might mean that we're defended against something, right? So people who tend to want to gloss over really complex problems and get to relief too quickly are probably struggling to plumb the depths, right? Really, really feel what's involved in a problem that needs to be tended to and might cause anger, frustration, resentment. Right? I mean, a lot of people who go into therapy, they do so because somebody was hurting them, somebody else was bearing witness and didn't do much to protect them. Right? And the child might even have told another adult, hey, something bad happened to me, right? Somebody hurt me, only to hear, I'm sure they didn't mean it. You're okay, right? We're okay. Let's feel better, right? Sometimes we can use feelings associated with well-being defensively. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Allie, hi. Allie, if you can unmute, that'd be great.
Thank you so much. So your work is around this intersection between Buddhism and psychotherapy. And I heard a lot today around co-regulation, right? And that we are relational beings. And that so much of our, especially our emotional experience, comes from that relation. But so much of Buddhist practice is single, meditative. So I'm interested in that. Yeah, can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Allie. Well, interestingly, the evolution of the Dharma really started to move toward awareness of how relational we are. So the original Dharma, the Theravadan tradition, was oriented toward working with one's own mind and renouncing repetitive mental problems and struggles, and swapping them out for so-called wholesome arisings and experiences. And even in the Theravadan tradition, the mentor was also considered an essential part of that process, which is why the Buddha is one of the three gems, right? The Buddha being any spiritual friend or mentor who shows us a way, offers inspiration. But then when the Mahayana path emerged, the relationship really became central to well-being. Right? And what was then suggested is the only way to awaken the truth of who we are is to be in active relationship with others, right? To notice that everybody around us, to some extent, is suffering, that suffering is on a continuum, and to really keep the mind and the heart open to the truth of others, and that it is through otherness that we discover the most precious resources of our own mind. And then in the Vajrayana path, which came next, the mentor-disciple dynamic, similar to the psychoanalytic pair, was considered the agent, the agent for awakening, right? That we really need the mind of the mentor in order to discover what our mind is capable of. Yeah. Thank you, Allie. Any other questions or anything that was stirred during my brief comments? Eileen, hi.
Hi, good evening. It's Pilar, isn't it? Or
Yeah,
Pilar?
yeah,
Right.
thank you.
Um, as someone who worked for many years as a social worker with children, adolescents, families, I saw from the very beginning that film that you showed, these early relationships or lack of them really set the stage in our lives. And I guess studying Buddhist philosophy and trying to, understand the reality of that too, um, that so much of how we respond to things, how we organize ourselves and our defenses are really from those very early experiences. So I guess I don't know if there's a question as much as sometimes I find it. I'm glad that tonight that you were able to put these two things together because we hear things like, well, you shouldn't seek recognition from others. In other words, you shouldn't be hungry and clinging too much in terms of attachment, right? But at the same time, the early attachment is really also a deep foundation. So I don't know if you could address a little, I mean, you have been, but just a little bit of that. Um,
Sure, I'd be happy to. Are you mid-thought, Eileen?
it's not that sometimes I get confused between studying Buddhist philosophy and psychology because, we can say things like, well, things are karmic. Well, sure, it's karmic for a child to be born into a family where there's a lot of dysfunction, as opposed to a child who's born into a situation where maybe there's not as much. But that doesn't solve it for me in terms of having compassion and empathy for each child's situation.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. And karma is a teaching that can easily get misinterpreted.
Mhm.
And really it's just drawing our attention to causes and the effect of causes, the result of causes, right? It's not meant to be a teaching on fate or being predestined to something because of some prior experience. But I do think one way we can practice compassion is to just appreciate how sensitive we are and how profoundly impacted we are by our origins. Right? We carry those relational structures deep within the mind. The good news is, because of our neuroplasticity, because of our emptiness and our dynamic nature, if our relational experiences change, then our sense of self will change accordingly, right? The way we navigate life will change accordingly. So it's never a done deal based on those early imprints. And we are powerfully impacted by how we're responded to, especially when we have such a heightened level of need, right? When we need the other to help us stay in being, we really internalize their response. So thank you, Eileen.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I see a question in the chat. Wonder if I could speak about how one should address anger with things that are from the past, yesterday, last year, 10 years ago, and how it relates to letting go of the past. Should you tell someone who's angry from past experience, you need to let go of the past, or is that in fact harmful? Yeah. This is an excellent question. And most people actually, to some extent, wish they could let go of the past, right? For those of you who have been in therapy for some time, you probably have moments where you think, this again. I thought I had worked it out, right? Something's coming up for me again. That happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago, whatever. But the psyche truly has its own timeline. The psyche is just so layered, not only with our own personal experience, but our parents, our grandparents, right? We know this from the research in epigenetics. We are carrying multiple generations in our mind and in our heart. Jung and others, and many Jungians would say, we're also carrying layers from the collective, right? From our ancestors. And so it makes sense that something that happened 10 years ago or 60 years ago it's gonna be felt. It's gonna get stirred from time to time. I actually think that is just the nature of the human condition. The question is, are we repetitively drawn into a response to what gets stirred, and in a way that causes us suffering or other people suffering, right? So for instance, if we're reminded of a trauma and we're filled with shame, right? We feel convinced that we're lacking something that we should have if we were more capable, then that response needs to be tended to. But if something comes up from the past and it makes us cry, right? We feel some anguish, right? We feel maybe even compassion for who we were 50 or 60 or 70 years ago and going through that, then actually that's a heart opener, right? It's also a mind opener. Yeah. Snehi, hi.
Hi, Pilar. I was so intrigued by, a comment you made with the slide that said, why do we adapt or adopt a self for ourselves? That we take on the notion of a self, and how is that helpful to us? Because it's like a protective mechanism, but then that also leads to suffering. So we took it because we thought we were protecting ourselves from suffering, but then in acquiring that, we also generate more suffering. So and most people, like you said, don't talk about that, like why we adapt this.
Yeah, it can be very illuminating, right? Because there are endless teachings in this tradition that just want us to understand the fallout, the impact of that self-grasping. Because we all know how much we suffer when we feel too separate from others, right? We feel unsafe, we feel too alone, right? We feel deprived. But there is a reason why we are repetitively having that experience. And I think Jack Engler's insight that that deepest root cause of anxiety, of not existing in a solid way, might be the engine for that self-grasping. Yeah, it's worth considering.
Thank you.
Thank you, Snehi. Okay, is there a last question before we do a final practice? Okay, and I haven't missed anything in the chat. Okay. So in that case, I would love to just invite you now to get comfy. Feel free to take some time to adjust if you want to stand or you want to stretch a little bit, please do so. If you want to rotate your ankles, shift your cushion. This is the silver lining of Zoom, right? You can massage your feet. Do whatever helps your body start to look forward to this time of practice. And if it's helpful, you can also just start to sense a little bit of elongation in the back of the body, throughout the spine, maybe especially so that you feel a nice opening in the back of the neck. Allowing your shoulders to soften and release. And beginning to notice the support of your chair or your cushion or sofa, whatever it is that's holding your body. Just begin to release into that support. Inviting any muscles that you might have been using outside of awareness to begin to soften, to release. Your hands can be gently resting on your thighs or cupped with the thumbs gently touching up at the top of the thighs. Whatever feels most comfortable for you. And as a way of starting to bring your mind and your body into closer contact, you can begin to gently allow your awareness to drop into the breath. Wherever you're most conscious of your breath. It could be in the belly, or the rising and falling of the chest. Could be in the cool air you notice coming and going from the nostrils. Without any effort to control the rhythms of your breathing body. Just take a minute or two to allow your mind to rest right on the breath. Feeling each inhalation and exhalation offering you a little more energy alongside a deepening sense of decompression. Sensing the wisdom of the breathing body. As each cycle of breath offers you an entry into your mind, your heart, perhaps expanding that sense of your own mind and heart with each in-breath and out-breath. And then at your own pace, I invite you to notice if the feeling of anxiety or the feeling of anger is present or familiar, something you can dip your toe into psychically. And without any effort, without any pressure to follow what you've noticed, first just to take a few moments to notice if this experience of anxiety or anger is located anywhere in the body. It could be some pulsing in the jaw, or some tension in the chest. Some gripping in the solar plexus. Wherever you notice that your body might be holding some residue of this feeling, just invite you to begin to breathe into that area very gently. Making a little more room for what you've noticed. And as you're noticing this sensation, or it could be more than one sensation, again, without any pressure, with real gentleness, take a moment or two to see if this experience in the body might help you also notice a belief that you're carrying in connection to this anxiety or anger. It could be a belief about who you are or what's expected of you. It could be a belief about how relationships work and how they will impact you. Just notice whatever comes to mind. Just holding it spaciously, gently, with tenderness. And if you've become aware of a belief or a point of view that you sense you would like to return to and work with, perhaps to feel into some of the deeper layers, just invite you to really gently set the intention to come back to this awareness. And perhaps to ground this intention in your own deepest and genuine wish to be freed from whatever might have caused you suffering or distress. From whatever dynamic might have burdened you in the past. And to imagine that this noble exploratory process will have countless healing ripple effects. Perhaps offering to the people in your life a sense of possibility, needed change, increased ease, and well-being. And lastly, just also including the countless other people in this world who, like you, share the wish to work deeply and skillfully with your own mind and heart in order to tap into your most precious resource of insight and compassion, your mind of clear seeing. Imagining them all joining you in this noble endeavor. And then at the sound of the bell and at your own pace, gently opening your eyes. Thank you so much, everyone, for your presence, for your practice. Very happy to have been with you and to see old friends, loving faces. And I hope to see you again next week. We will meet at the same time for the next 2 weeks. I think next week we're going to be moving on to grief and mourning, and then to desire and envy. So it should be a fun ride. Until then, have a wonderful week. Thank you, Wiley, so much, and everyone here at Shantideva.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank
I'm
you.
so glad. Be well, everybody. Hope to see you soon.